Okay folks, in this lesson we take a look at the standard surface shader. Now before going through with that, let me walk you through the scene. We are going to be using the famous shader ball scene from the masteringcgi.com.au. You can take a look at the scene. You can see for the lighting we have this Arnold sky, and we are using this basically shader network as the color, and here we have this HDRI image that you can find in your project files in the text folder for this shading section of the course. Okay, so that's great. And the shader ball itself, as you can see, that is a geometry here, and we have some geometries like this inner ball or this ring geometry here, that they have this default materials with the image defined here as the base color. And the only thing you need to do is to create your standard shader or any other shader and assign it to the shader ball parent, so you can actually see how it will look in the render. Now, at the time being, this shader ball geometry has the standard surface material applied to. Let me just delete this and create a new Arnold standard surface shader and assign it to my shader ball. And if you render the scene, the result is going to be something like that. So let me open up the standard surface and let's take a look at different parameters that we have here. Now, the first thing I want to talk about, as you can see, we have this material presets. So if you want to quickly create a material, you can actually use this preset. We have this plastic presets. Let me just run the IPR. We have this plastic preset, we have this metal preset, so you immediately get a metal shader. You have this glass preset, you have the skin preset, and this thin presets for stuff like, for example, paper. We talk about this later on. Now let me just decrease the diffuse weight to 0.8 for the time being. The standard surface shader is a physically based shader capable of producing many types of materials. It has a diffuse or a base layer, a specular layer, we have a transmission or a refraction layer, subsurface layer, a coat layer, an emission layer. We also have a bunch of other components that we will be discussing them later on in this section, but in this lesson we are going to be taking a look at the base parameters. So for now, let's go to the specular section. As you can see, the specular weight by default is set to 1, and that's why we are getting this reflective shader ball in our render. And if I zero it out, you can see now we only have the base or the diffuse portion of the shader. Now let me actually go to the network editor so we can use this space to maybe assign some textures. So the first parameter here is the base weight, and this is basically the base color weight. So if you define a color here, you can then decide how much of that color you want to be in your render. For example, we have this white color and we are only using 0.8 or 80% of that color, and if I use a smaller weight amount, you can see we are basically gonna get a darker and darker result. Or if I change the color to something else, you can see using the weight we can control how much of that color we want. Now let me set the color to its default value. You can obviously use a texture to control the base color. So in this case, let me select my standard surface shader, then press Ctrl Tab, and let's look for an image node. And it asks us to what parameter we want to connect this image node. We want to control the base color. So there you go. Let me just make sure the auto file browser when creating an image shader is enabled. Also, another way obviously to add your image shader, just if you are not into shortcuts, just search for the image node in your shader tree, drag and drop, and now you can actually basically load the texture that you want to use. Let me just go to the shading section, text folder, and let's use this parquet. And now connect it to the base color. Now you can actually see that image being used as the base color. I'm probably going to select my image and let's increase its scale U and V to 2 so we get a bit more repetition. So as you can see now, the base color parameter is gone because it's being controlled by this image shader. Okay, and now when you use a texture to control the base color, you probably want to set the weight to 1 because you already have decided on the saturation and brightness of your image when you have created it. But in case you want a bit more control, you can use the weight to control how much of the diffuse or the base portion you want to contribute to the overall material. Obviously, you can still control the image and how it looks using a color correct node and using different parameters that you can find in the image node itself, like controlling the UV and some image attributes, but we will discuss them later on. Now the next parameter that we have here, let me just disconnect this connection by just clicking on this connection here and set the base weight to 0.8 again. Next we have this diffuse roughness, which controls how rough or smooth the surface is. For a surface like plastic, you need to use a lower value, and for a surface like sand or concrete, you would need a higher value. You can see by default it's set to 0, and as I'm going to increase this, you can see we're getting this rougher surface. And obviously we can control this parameter also with a texture, and if let's use a checkerboard texture, and control the diffuse roughness with it. Let me just connect the checkerboard pattern directly to the Arnold Beauty so I can see how it looks on my shader ball. Now I can select the checkerboard and increase the U and V frequency to just get a bit more repetition, probably 5 and 5. And now let's select our standard surface shader and connect it to the Arnold Beauty. Now as you can see, where the pattern is white, we get this rougher areas, and where the pattern is dark and therefore have a value of 0, we are gonna get this smoother areas. Okay, so let me just disconnect this connection as well. The next parameter we have here is the metalness, that basically allows you to create metal-like surfaces very easily. With the metalness value set to 1, you're gonna have a surface that behaves like metal, and you can see how easy it is. So if I increase my metalness value, boom, we have a metal shader. Now prior to Arnold 5, the way we used to create metals was to set the base weight to 0 and increase the specular weight to something like 1, then increasing the IRR value to something like 22, very high, and then there you have a metal shader. But right now what they have done in Arnold 5, they have made the whole process a lot easier, and also it's more physically accurate. So what you need to do, let me just set the IRR to the default value. What you need to do, just make sure your base weight is set to 1, your specular weight is set to 1, and then increase the metalness value. And there you have it, you have a metal shader, and now you can control the roughness of your metal using this roughness in the specular section. And also down here you have different metal presets that you can use with the metalness value. So before going through these presets, when you actually increase the metalness value, the color that controls the appearance of your metal is the base color mainly. So the specular color also affects the edge tint, but the base color controls the appearance of the metal. Let me just use maybe something like that. In this case, now the base color controls the appearance of the metal on the faces that are basically parallel to your viewing direction, and the specular color in this mode controls the metal appearance on the edges and perpendicular angles. So if I change this value to a very obvious value, you can hopefully be able to see this specular color on the edges, but we're going to be taking a look at the metalness value when we discuss specular section in our next lesson, because they are so intertwined. So for now, let me just reset the specular color to default. Now, as I was saying, we have this metal preset section. You have different metals. You got aluminium, you got something like copper. And when you actually set these presets, you can notice that the base color and the specular color are changing based on the preset that you define. And obviously, when you set these presets, you can go ahead and adjust how they look and their color to basically create different looks, right? Now we have a different look. And we can try maybe something like silver. Now we can probably increase the roughness. So that's how the metalness value also works. Okay, I think this is enough for this lesson. We discussed the base parameters of our standard surface shader. And in the next lesson, we take a look at the specular section in conjunction with the metalness parameters that are really related also to the specular section. So we discuss them in our next lesson.